Okay, we're the 8th of August 2022, and I have taken the conscious decision of sharing all the documents that I have been working on and I had been working on over the past few months. And this is the result of many years of study and life experience. And I will not tell the story, because if you are interested, watch my previous video in the reverse chronological order and you will understand. But simply speaking, I understood that I was trying to achieve intellectual perfection, because I thought that otherwise people would not be interested in what I have to say. But actually I understood that I have to let go of this temptation, one might say, and just share the current state of what I've been working on. And here, this video simply presents the formal structure of what I call simply knowledge, to know something, and which is also the process of the development and the unfolding and the coming to consciousness of itself, of God, which is simply, I mean, it's simply expressed, but it's very complicated. It's the totality of being becoming conscious of itself. It is spirit coming to cognition of itself. And here is the formal structure, which I simply copied, in a way, the structure of the Encyclopedia, of the writings of Hegel. And I have the same document that I have filled with my own worldview, because I know myself, in philosophical language, to be the negative of the substance, which means in order to become conscious of itself, the totality has to detach itself from itself, to fragment itself, and this is what gives rise to human consciousness. And only by being detached from the substance, here I speak like a philosopher, one can have the view of the totality, basically. But then there's the problem of the moral wrong, or the moral negativity, that which we call evil. So yeah, that's a problem. But here I grant myself, let us say, 1 hour to simply talk as a scientist, one might say, and to explain in intelligible language, which, because of the reasons that I have mentioned previously, it will not be perfectly clear, but I express with my own words what I understand at this moment in time. And I will publish maybe tomorrow or the day after, in a few days, because this is what I am working on. I will publish the same document with the categories on both sides, all the points of view that I have become aware of. But here it's empty, so it's really the backbone, it's the pure structure, but I have the same document with the categories that I will publish. But this one is like a blank slate, one might say, and if you follow this video and if you focus, you will be able to feel with your own experience, whoever you are, as a thinking human, to feel the categories on both sides with your own perspective, your own viewpoint. That's what I have done in my documents that I'm working on and that I will publish later. But on this one, it's the pure abstraction, but I will comment nonetheless to express and explain the method. So logic, that which is the science or the doctrine of the determinations, the laws, the rules, the categories of pure thought. So it's the pure abstraction of thought, thinking itself in relation to itself, and all the categories which are the determination that thought, through the mediation of the mind of God or the mind of humans or the mind of any thinking entity, uses to think itself and to categorize the object. An object is a logical category that we experience, that I experience, as an objective world. The world is my object, and I think about the world, and every thinking agent spontaneously and unconsciously uses categories to classify, order, make sense of his or her relationship to reality. And where do these categories, like quality, quantity, measure, identity, difference, cause, consequence, existence, essence, substance, actuality, form, content, etc., the concepts that are used, where do they come from? Where do they emerge? Why do we spontaneously use them? There are various explanations provided by philosophers. Some say, like the empiricist, like Locke, here I simplify to the utmost, they say that it's a repeated experience of reality. We we are born with a blank slate in our mind, and through a repeated use of habits and experience, we fill our mind with categories, but actually they are acquired, and those like Leibniz, this is a 17th century debate, say that they are ingrained in our mind by God. Basically, these are parcels or sparks of divinity in our mind. I simplify really to the utmost, but here Hegelian logic or speculative logic shows the unfolding process of how the categories emerge in the mind of God, and eventually, because men are made in the image of God, in the mind of men. But, yeah, and one can liberate oneself and become master of one's own thought and understand reality by studying and reflecting upon the logical content of one's mind. Basically, to think properly, correctly, and to apprehend, to grasp cognitively reality. So this is God in its pure abstraction, the unfolding of the logical idea in the language of German philosophy. And here, by a process that at this moment I do not understand, maybe I will never understand, but the logical idea, which is God as a pure abstraction, but as a totality in relation to itself as a thinking entity. This pure mind, one might say, gives rise. When, how, why, I don't know yet, but because it's not fully clear, but gives rise to nature, which is the world of time, space, and matter. And it seems unintelligible. This is what the religion calls creation, but simply the modern atheistic scientists, the rationalists, the empiricists, they all agree that nature is rational. Einstein said one of the most astonishing or amazing determination, he didn't use the word determination, but one of the most amazing Bestimmtheit or determinacy of the universe is that it is rational and that it can be understood. And every scientist is supposed to know that the world of nature occurs, unfolds according to laws. The laws are sometimes very well hidden, they are obscure, they are difficult to grasp, they are complex, they are undetermined sometimes, but the laws are there. Even on the quantum level with the principle of uncertainty, even the quantum physicists, they agree that in spite of the principle of uncertainty, they expect the movement of the planets, the laws of gravity, the reproduction of animals, the chemical properties of objects to remain stable under stable circumstances. So they agree that the world is rational. So yeah, so the Naturphilosophie in modern language contains physics, chemistry, biology, and the earth sciences, basically. Physics, chemistry, the earth sciences, biology, and the sub-sections, which are the particularization of each of these universal branches, like zoology, etc., etc. So here I will go very simply. So when it's written in German, in yellow, blue, green here, these are the categories, the distinction, the Bestimmtheiten, the determinacies of the Encyclopedia. Here in clear blue, I added this myself. It's in ordinary language. So what this means is that every thinking human that has ever thought about the cosmos, about the natural world, has had a vision, not in the sense of eye contact, but a view, Weltanschauung, a view of what nature is. Even those who do not think about this, if you ask them what is the world, they will say, I don't know what they will say, but precisely everyone has more or less a more or less clear view of what the physical world, the universe, the cosmos, the heavenly sky is. And the process is simply that this is what the mythologies talk about, the creation of the world. But through the historical process, men, human beings, have come to acquire a more clearer, more determined, more accurate vision of what the cosmos is. And it began in the 17th century with Newton, with the mathematical understanding of the laws of the heavenly spheres. And it has only improved from quantitative and scientific viewpoint in terms of accuracy over the past 3 or 4 centuries. And what happens today in the world is that there are theoretical physicists who have a very clear view of cosmology, it's still, there are many questions left to be answered, but they have a clearer and clearer view, and through the mediation of the spread of information by the internet, publications, but mostly the internet, anyone with an internet connection throughout the world can access the conferences of the most, not necessarily the most brilliant, but at least the most, maybe the most brilliant theoretical physicist, and anyone who has the time, the hobbies, and the intellectual level can follow conferences, lectures about the current state of cosmological knowledge. That's what's happening. So I will here reformulate in very simple language what the process of God is all about. Here it's really simplified. There is being, in this case, nature, and there is the thought of being, namely the knowledge that human beings, who are a particular type of beings, human beings, have, so the thought that they have about being. So there is being and the thought of being. And what has happened in the historical process is that a certain particular determined type of being, namely human beings, who are thinking beings, have thought in the historical perspective about being as a physical object, namely what we call the world or the cosmos or the universe, and their thought about the universe has become clearer, more accurate throughout the centuries. It began with myth, and now we have science. Both tell the same stories, but science can prove mathematically what myth can only point at with metaphors, etc. So yeah, that's why the structure of the Encyclopedia is both the structure of being, what is, and the structure of thought, namely how being comes to think itself, and the thinking agents within being, we call these thinking humans, basically. Okay, I will not elaborate as long for each section, but now I have been talking for 12 minutes. This is what I wanted to say. It works for every category. So here it's the physique. It contains more determined aspect of physics. Here it's more general. It's what we call quantum mechanics, relativity, astronomy. Here it would be electromagnetism, acoustics, thermodynamics, etc., plus chemistry. And here in clear blue, these are categories that I've used in order to make things intelligible. And for instance, pollution and health, they are in the realm of human society. It's not, strictly speaking, physics as such, but these are simply to illustrate the consequences. And I will not do this for every category, but just to illustrate, most people in the developed world are aware that chemistry, industrial production of chemical plants produces pollution, which has an impact upon the pollution of the air. There are people who die of lung problems throughout the world who are forced to wear masks, not because of COVID, but because of the pollution in the air. It brings about health issues, the pollution of water, the pollution of the soil. So that's just an illustration to say that the chemical structure of reality, which has become understood by men throughout the centuries, mostly 18th, 19th century, they understand the chemical properties. It has been implemented through economic policies and industrial policies, which has brought about economic development, which has had positive and negative effects. A lot of chemical drugs, in the good sense, medical drugs, medicine, are made of chemicals, and people are usually satisfied with being able to live longer, in better health, etc. But it has also its negative aspects, namely the pollution of chemical plants, chemical industries bring about the pollution of water, soil, etc., etc. So this is an illustration of a debate, and most people, at least in the Western world, have a view of chemistry in this broader sense. It doesn't mean that they are chemists or that they have a degree in chemistry, but they can talk, and this is one of the debates which structures the activity of spirit, in a sense, in everyday life. Okay, then organic physics. So in green, again, these are the categories of the Encyclopedia, and here I just illustrate with ordinary categories the struggle to acquire natural resources, oil, rare earth, I'm not sure that's the orthographic correct, but gas, metals, minerals, renewable energy. The debates that are found in the political, geopolitical realm in every day, in all over the world, in the news, on TV, when people talk, what determines the economic military, diplomatic strategies of countries is the search for resources, which are determination of geological nature. So these are just illustrations. So I will here take the time at the beginning and then I will go faster, but the Earth is geologically determined, which has had an impact upon racial and evolutionary biology, upon geography and history. The history of countries is partly determined by the geological structure of the continents, for instance. But that's one level, but another level is, and I did not include this because it's so self-evident, but another level is that history has been also shaped since ancient Egypt and probably even before by the will to acquire certain resources, and there are conflicts between various states. So it's a typically Marxist view, but it's common sense, one might say, and this is just an illustration here. So I mostly used categories used in modern Western debate, but actually they can be retrospectively projected onto the entire historical process, because I know, for instance, that already in ancient Egypt there were struggles between Egypt and some of its neighbors in the Middle East to acquire precious metals. And the Greeks, in ancient Greeks, there were mines of silver, and they struggled and they enslaved one another to acquire metals. And the history of antiquity is divided into geological and eras determined by metal, Bronze Age, the Age of Iron, etc., etc. It's common sense at this point, but yeah, okay. The vegetabilische Natur, here we would have the theory of evolution, genetics, botany. So here we would have question about agriculture, soil erosion, deforestation, and here in the document that I will share later, I have made my own view, but anyone can. Once this becomes public, anyone can share this. There are people, you could put them on the left, but who are against deforestation, and those who say they do not want to get rid of the forest for the sake of doing this, but because they think economic development is more important, or they are willing to sacrifice the well-being of the planet for economic prosperity. So they could be on the right, and those who say we have to favor the capacity of the earth of recycling the carbon and producing oxygen, etc. So the long term, here you would have left-wing ecologists thinking long term, and here right-wing economists thinking short term. I caricature, but basically that's how it is. Here you would have people who would have a more traditional sustainable view of agriculture. Here this would be industrial agriculture, and this division occurs all over the world. Every society has a view about how agriculture should be handled. Even the pastoralists, they believe that agriculture should not exist, basically. So it includes everything, basically. Okay. So here, tierische Organismus would be zoology. So here it's not only the classification of species, the study of animals, etc., but also the threat of the extinction of species. So here we have anatomy and physiology, and all the study, the accumulated knowledge of mankind since ancient time about medicine, public health. So the debates about COVID, they would take place here. For instance, the health system, should we have socialized medicine, private capitalized investment, each person invests his own money and work into his own insurance, or should it be socialized data? So you have debates about biology, about medicine, about sociology, about economics, etc., etc. So that's why these are simply the categories to make the structure intelligible. So there was logic, nature, and now Philosophie des Geistes. Here we have anthropology, the question of ethnocentrism, demographics, sex differences, reproductive strategies. These are the kind of debates that occur in the West. So here I repeat again once and then I go faster. It's been 20 minutes basically. There is the level of ontology, namely that every human being is determined socio-biologically, anthropologically, and racially, in a sense. Every human being is determined to have a body which is determined anthropologically, a certain quantitative determination of genes which give each human his own particular appearance and his own singular appearance, namely the gene of his ethnic group and the gene of his parents, basically. That's the ethnic group is the level of the particular, the gene of the parents or the family on the singular level. So that's the level of ontology. In the sense, every human is biologically determined, but then there's the level of thought, one might say, and then there are the debates about racism, anti-racism, acceptance of the other, cooperation with others, or hostility toward the odd group, etc. These are the debates which structure, but you cannot have one view of saying this is how things are, and on the other side, this is how things are thought about, how they are envisioned, because the two coincide in a way. To take a very simple example, demographics. This is an ontological determination, namely the evolution of human population is part of being, but a demographic policy, which is a determination of objective spirit of politics, can influence and shape demographics. There can be pro-birth natalist policies and policies to reduce birth, etc. So there are the two levels, ontology and thought, and they interact with one another. And the more one understands how things are, the more one can change the process in a way. And this is part of the process. That's why the philosophy of Hegel can be quite complex sometimes. I laugh, but actually, this is really extremely complex. Not what I am saying, but the process. It's really extremely complex, because here I just make one note. The history of sex differences, from a biological standpoint, it has existed for hundreds of thousands of years in the chronological timeline, and even millions of years since the separation of mammals, and even before, and then pre-humans or pre-hominid or pre-homo sapiens or whatever. It has occurred for countless quantitative determination of time, and the thought of these differences has evolved. So, yeah. And here, for instance, you would have the feminist would be here, and the gender realist, if one had to call them, would be here, but they are in a dialectical interaction. So here we have more determined racial anthropology, questions about immigration, demographics, the question of racism. Here you would have the anti-racists, and here the people who are either race realists, who are outright or who are outright racists. And this structures the life of every society. Sex and gender differences. These are the kind of debates that occur in the West daily. Here about sexuality. So here it's really modern in the sense that condoms, the pill, and the hookup culture. I mean, the hookup culture probably has already existed, but has always existed in one form or another. It's just the word, but and pills, even contraceptive pills, it's a modern invention of the past, I think, 60 years. But contraceptive methods have existed in the most ancient antiquity. Condoms, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's just an illustration. And these in green, these are determinations that I use myself. But here in yellow, these are the determinations, the Bestimmtheiten, not the determination, the Determinacy, the divisions of the Encyclopedia. So here we have psychology, psychiatry, psychoanalysis, language, and in case it is not clear, every determination is brought forth by the previous one. Namely, sociobiology is a product of zoology, anatomy, physiology, and racial anthropology is a product of sociobiology. Sex and gender differences, it should be here next to one another, because race and sex are united, and although different, but yeah. And sexuality is a logical unfolding of the determinacy of sex and gender differences. And psychology is determined by anthropology, zoology, etc. It doesn't pop out of nowhere. It's a process. It follows a logical thread. So it's logically structured in a way. It's not perfect. It's not very rigorous. There are many more categories which could be added. But precisely, I started the video by saying that I share my documents, and I will try to improve my own worldview in terms of rigor, systematicity, coherence, the ability to provide understanding as long as I can, but if I cannot, others will do this, whether if they are interested or not, but yeah. Yeah. Here, for instance, I know that dogs and monkeys can have a sense of humor, although strictly speaking, they have no articulate spoken language. So here would be a philosophical debate about the humor of monkeys and dogs. Yeah. Intelligence and IQ. Here the question of eugenics and dysgenics. So here you would be against eugenics. Here you would be in favor, for instance. The educational system. So here, in case it's not clear, the educational system exists in Western democratic societies, has existed for the past 200 years at best, sometimes even less, sometimes more. The public educational system, it's 100 years old, 150 years old, then it depends on which country, but before education become mandatory and public at the end of the 19th century, or sometimes in the 18th century in the most enlightened progressive countries, sometimes only in the 20th century in some non-Western countries, etc. Before it occurred, there were educational systems. They were not public, widespread, etc., but there were modes of transmitting knowledge. Even in the most primitive tribes, where there is no institution, impersonal institution like an educational system, there are ways, methods of transmitting knowledge. So these are mostly the categories of the modern Western world, because on an empirical level, this is the world in which I live, but it can be applied to any society at any time. Okay, the objective Geist. So law is a determination of the Encyclopedia, and here it's more, yeah. So the question, these kind of questions, they are mostly derived from American society, but they pervade the entire Western world, and actually the entire world. Then again, even in the most remote society in Amazonia or wherever, they do not have debates about gun ownership, but probably. The anthropologists should probably be able to answer this question. There are certain objects which are allowed to be possessed by certain people, those which are not allowed, etc., etc., probably. Yeah, here we have debates which structure and shape the life of the modern West. I put this into morality, political correctness, etc., etc. So here it's particular to the modern Western world. These debates. The debates are around the legacy of May 1968. As you can probably guess, they did not exist in May 1967. I hope that we can all agree on that. Yeah. Yeah, so this is what Westerners, mostly in America, but also in England, France, Germany, Canada, etc., etc., they talk about every day. But in a way, I have no empirical knowledge of India or China or even Brazil or Congo, and I'm sure that they do not talk about May 68 in some countries, but hopefully in some African country, hopefully Black Lives Matter for them. I know that in some countries it doesn't, because there are conflicts in many African countries, but the question of colonialism, it's from the perspective of guilt, it's a Western thing, but from the perspective of most non-Western countries, it has to be a debate, because their country is structured and shaped by the legacy, for good or for bad, of colonialism. Yeah. Economics. So here are some categories. Here, the BRICS are talked about mostly in the West, but Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they talk about themselves every day, I think. I mean, I know that there are countries where people are not allowed to express their thoughts, but yeah, there are various degrees of free speech depending on the countries. But these are the kind of... But then again, here I talk again... in a society of hunter-gatherers, there are no debates about socialism or free market or protectionism, but actually, partly, these are just words. And socialism, the theory of socialism, is much more elaborate, and it's the result of a historical process of development, a cognitive process, etc. The working class becoming conscious of itself, as the Marxists would say, and they are partly right, although in the modern Western world, these are not workers who develop socialist ideas, but scholars. But yeah. But the debate between socialism and free markets, freedom of entrepreneurship, it exists even in the most primitive, from the perspective of modern institutions, the modern standards of the Western world, it exists in even the most primitive societies. If in a very small tribe of an African savannah tens of thousands of years ago, should we dare cross this river to try to explore this new territory, the free market capitalist of the old age will say, yes, let us be brave, let us take risks to try to make a profit. And the socialist would say, no, let us collectivize the berries and the mushrooms or whatever. Probably the descendants of the capitalist African hunter-gatherers, they have thrived. I'm not sure that the descendants of the collectivist berry pickers of the savannah plains of Africa 60,000 years ago, I'm not sure that they thrived, but who knows? I will make a little evolutionary joke, but if, from the perspective of sociobiology, and reproductive. So if socialism still exists today all over the world in various forms, it's because the idea of socialism has survived the test of Darwinian selection from this perspective. So actually, socialism is not always a bad idea. Yeah. Here we have questions about how to feed the entire world population, food shortages, the problem of famine in some countries, most notably in Africa, etc. Then there is the question of finance. Here it's especially in Western Europe or in Europe at large, in the European countries which use the euro currency. The Fed is mostly American, but actually it impacts the whole world through their economic policies, etc. Sociology. So here it's particularized from the modern Western world, the 2010s, 2020s, and the legacy of the past 50 years, basically. But the question of the generations and the struggles and the conflicts between the generations is a universal human determination. In every society, the young try to overthrow the old try to cling to their status, they try to cooperate, there are various modes of integrating the youth, etc., to try to stabilize society. This is a universal anthropological determination from the perspective of sociology. Yeah. So this is what we find. Crime exists since biblical times. Abel and Cain, the first criminal officially. Yeah. So we can find this in all over the world and throughout the ages. The separation of power from a political standpoint. So here's the political power, but also the psychological power. It's power on an individual level, the ability to dominate other, to manipulate eventually, or simply to assert one's authority, but also the collective and political division of power, corruption, also, etc. Here are some of the most simple political division: left, right, democracy, authoritarianism, etc., etc. Nostalgia for, it's not here in the psychological nostalgia on an individual level, it's nostalgia for a political ideal, the lost paradise in the realm of politics. Utopia, and depending if you're a left-winger, a right-winger, a Westerner, or a non-Western, old or young, your utopia will be different. One might say the utopia of Bacon Francis Bacon has become our daily nightmare, would say the leftist. And yeah. So here are some of the debates about ecology. And yeah, so here I will just make one remark. Climate is a determination of, I would say, geology in a way. The Earth as a totality, so climate would be here, but the debates about climate change, they are a thinking reaction to the change of environment, and that's why they belong to objective spirit. That's why you have the ontological level and the level of thinking, and they interact with one another. There is the climate which exists supposedly independently of human beings, that's climatic realism, if one might say, but I actually know, because in order for something to be perceived, there has to be a consciousness, but here that's another debate. But let us imagine climatic realism, and then there is climatic idealism, namely that climate should be regulated, it was better when it was colder, or it's better when it's more temperate. So there are the two levels, but they interact with one another. They cannot be distinguished from one another, because, yeah. Debate about technology, the media. That's why it's not very structured, because it lacks coherence. But I said, I've been saying in my previous video that I will share my documents that I had been working on, although they are unfinished. And people, now that when I will publish this, I don't know when, probably we are the 8th of August, maybe tomorrow, or I don't know, but it will become public property, and people then are free it's supposed to help people think about, or to help, I don't know if it's help, but to enable to think properly about becoming conscious of itself. So that's the categorization, the classification of God, basically. And Hegel would say that's formalism, the idea which try to formalize the process. That's he talks about this in the preface, like a skeleton. He can be very annoying. Whatever you do on an intellectual level, if it's not perfect, Hegel comes and say, that's not satisfactory. That's formalism. That's lack of method. So if you have the method of formalism, that's not good because it's formalism. If you have no method, he complains because that's not rigorous. So Hegel is this arrogant, but he has reasons to be arrogant, because if I have to be honest, he knows what he's talking about, the writings of Hegel. But he looks like he's arrogant because he complains about everything. But actually, if I had to be honest, at the very high level, at least he's rigorous, which in this document I am not. So yeah. Here you have entertainment, the JQ, which is connected with the rest. Geopolitics, so debates around, and all these determinations, they do not exist independently from one another. They are entertainment for left-wingers, entertainment for right-wingers, through the mediation, spread through the mediation of technology, etc. The media, they say what is morally right and wrong. They denounce certain crimes and not some others. They promote certain economic policies, etc., etc. And some lobbies in the economic realm, finance, some media, etc. That's the interconnectedness of everything. It's just a simple structure. So here is the geopolitical debates of our time from a Western perspective, but from a Chinese perspective this would be different. But actually all these determinations, they are universally valid in a way. History, the falsification of history, 20th century, the history of nations, which is being written unconsciously by scholars and even sometimes ordinary people all over the world. They rewrite, because history has been falsified. But one could say here it's also Hegelian, either it's consciously falsified or simply it's false, because it's impossible or it's very difficult to think properly about the history of all nations, because this would mean to talk about the history of just one country, one would have to talk about the totality of all the determinations for each era, each decade of each century of the past 300, 500, 1,000 years or 3,000 years. So that's very difficult. But yeah. Here are the various civilizations. Historiography, the way history is written, has been written, or should be written. And finally, the absolute Geist, art, with various branches of art, but there are more. That's why I say it's not finished, and I will let people modify as they wish. Classical art, so there is pop music and classical music, pop cinema and classical cinema, one would say, but historically cinema was a pop culture at first, then it became, it acquired a higher reputation, etc. Various forms of spirituality, the native world spiritualities, cosmic consciousness, extraterrestrial life, if there is, that's a question, nihilism, traditionalism, the various religions, which, in case it's not clear, are supposed to talk about the totality of being. They use images, but they're myths, parables, metaphors, etc. Yeah. And here, European paganism. So here there are the various native world spiritualities, and here is the native European spirituality in its re-emergence, atheism, because atheism is determined by religion. It's the negative of religion, but it's in relation with religion. So atheists are religious people. They're just a negative relationship to religion. But yeah. Occultism, the end times, and finally philosophy, which is the totality of being, thinking itself, and cultural Hegelianism, the philosophy that I've been trying to promote, and that I will keep trying to promote until it prevails eventually, is the totality thinking itself, basically. And here's the very formal method, and yeah. And just here I said I would spend less, or 1 hour maximum. Here it has been 42 minutes. I will just make in a few minutes a comment, but potentially one could imagine that every thinking human, every adult thinking human, because in order to think vast and broad thoughts, one has to grow intellectually and to accumulate experience in a way. So every adult, but actually every thinking human, starting from the age whenever human can master language and speak, every thinking human has a broad view of poetry, painting. Even people who are deemed primitive in terms of material standards of living, the primitive tribes, they have poetry, they have painting or sculpture, they have music, they have no cinema, but they inhabit one of the continents. They tell themselves stories about their ancestors. They do not have complex international, I mean, in the modern world they are influenced indirectly, but they do not participate, or sometimes they do. There are primitive tribes in Brazil, native local tribes who have talked or have been heard at the United Nations in order to protect their native environments, etc. But let us take a modern person from Vietnam, an educated person. He has access to technology. He has a view of ecology, whether he's in favor or against. He thinks it hampers or threatens the possibility of economic growth, or maybe he has a permaculture farm, or maybe he wants the sovereignty of his country, maybe he wants to make alliances, whatever. So every person potentially has opinions which are determined by all his determinations about each of these topics. And some topics that have been listed, if you want to rewatch, just rewatch the video, are specific, which is particular to the current context of 21st century Western life, but most of these categories are universal. I just take one last example. The left and right divide in politics. Historically, it was born with the French Revolution in the context of the end of 18th century French political life, but left and right divide, these are universal division of politics, it exists in the US in the 21st century. We call this Democrats and Republicans. The content is different, namely the leftists in 18th century France and the Democrats in 21st century America have very different worldview, but they are nonetheless united while also being divided. And even in primitive tribes, there are political divides between leftists and right-wingers. The worlds are different. There are no institutions. They do not talk about the welfare state or welcoming migrants or reducing working hours, but probably, maybe at some level they do. But it's less unfolded. It's less developed in complexity. But this political divide exists in most societies. Even I know this in Stalinist Russia or in the Stalinist Soviet Union, there were left-wing Stalinists and right-wing Stalinists. In the Third Reich, there were left-wing National Socialists and right-wing National Socialists. So even in totalitarian states, where the contradiction or the opposition try to be reduced to a minimum, it re-emerges nonetheless. There were Stalinists who wanted more liberty and those who wanted more equality. So it exists at all levels, every society, every period, every era, every regime, etc., etc. And in working class, middle class, bourgeoisie, these are modern categories. But as Marx would say, in ancient Rome, there were no working class, middle class, etc. But there were the proletarians, pauperes, and the prosperes, how do you call this in English? Patricians, the elites and the people. Elites and people, it's a universal divide. And then the question is, what is the legitimacy of the elites? In ancient society, these were the warrior class. Then in the modern West, it's technocratic class. It used to be sometimes the religious, sometimes the best hunters, the best warriors, the best technocrats, the best scientists, the best leaders, the most charismatic, the most intelligent, the most corrupt. So it exists universally. I will make here a joke. White flight. How do you think the United States of America came into being? Future white Americans, they were already fleeing away from white people in Europe. They say, oh, we don't want to live with them. We have to leave England or Northern Europe and go to discover a new continent. So white flight is not an invention of the modern left. It already existed when Europe was completely white. White were already fleeing away from one another. Yeah. Money is historically determined. The metal coins exist, I think, since the first millennia. I'm sure it depends. Sometimes it's 4th century, sometimes it's even further, maybe the 8th century, the first. But I think it's around the 4th century BCE in some Greek regions. But money existed before in forms of shells, salt. Precious flowers. Sometimes I'm not sure that's the proper, but or a cattle, etc. So yeah, and before money, there was barter. I don't know, trade with direct barter. I think you call this in English. Before agriculture, there was hunter-gatherers, etc. So they are particularized in the modern context of the modern Western world, but these are universal because the particular contains within itself the universal. That's a teaching of the logic of Begriff. So that's what I had to say in broadly 50 minutes, and now I will keep working and I will publish the same backbone. This is the backbone, but there are no Glieders in German. There are no the members. This is the skeleton, basically, but there is no flesh. So I will publish my view, on which I have been working for many weeks, many months, but actually it's the result of my entire intellectual life. So I will publish with my own categories on both sides, right and left, which do not necessarily mean political right and political left, although it partly does. I will publish this document, which is, in my view, the phenomenology of my own mind, which I identified for good and bad with the mind of God, basically, my relation to an objective world. So here I have shown the simple formal structure, which can be and has to be improved as long as people find this interesting and have the will, the leisure, the possibility, the interest, whatever, to improve this. But I will offer, I'm not sure that it may necessarily be a pleasant gift for everyone, but I will share my view of the totality of being as I envision this, which is limited. It has to be by my own limited cognitive abilities, my own limited singularity, and my own limited context, namely Westerner, 30 years old, limited IQ, limited capabilities, but I have nonetheless traveled a lot in thought, and I will share my view in the coming days. But here was the skeleton of knowledge, one might say. And yeah.